In this episode of Mind the Gap, Michael Comyn reflects on one of the most underrated yet powerful traits we can bring to the world: kindness. In a time when sharpness is often mistaken for strength, and gentleness is dismissed as weakness, this episode invites us to reconsider. Drawing from Stoic wisdom, emotional intelligence, and his own experience as a coach and broadcaster, Michael explores how true kindness is neither passive nor performative. It's courageous. Here's Michael.
There's a moment I remember well. I was coaching a senior executive who'd just been through their annual review. The feedback from their team was overwhelmingly positive, thoughtful, kind, compassionate, steady. But one comment stood out, and not in a good way. Maybe a bit too nice to make the hard calls. Too nice. Those two words have teeth. They've been used to praise someone with faint concern, or to warn them quietly that they might not be cut out for leadership. They echo a suspicion that still lingers in many organizations, that kindness, emotional presence, and a steady temperament somehow signal softness, or worse, weakness. This episode of Mind the Gap is for anyone who's heard that they're too kind, or that they won't be taken seriously unless they toughen up. And it's especially for the leader who knows instinctively that being decent is not a liability, but who still doubts themselves in a world that often rewards bluster and performance over steadiness and grace. In modern organizational life, kindness is often underrepresented in leadership training and undervalued in performance reviews. We teach influence, strategy, stakeholder engagement. We don't often teach presence, compassion, and quiet strength. But the tide is shifting. Slowly perhaps, quietly, but it is shifting. Daniel Goleman, who brought emotional intelligence into the mainstream, has long made the case that the most effective leaders are not the loudest nor the most forceful. They're the ones who can manage their inner world and read the emotional tone of the room with accuracy. They understand that every decision, every conversation, every tone of voice carries emotional weight. According to Goleman's model, the key elements of emotional intelligence are self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation, empathy, and social skills. Nowhere in that list is domination or volume. Yet with decades of data supporting the value of emotional intelligence, some organizations still view kindness as suspicious, as if empathy comes at the expense of competence, or that compassion is the opposite of control. But let me ask you this. Have you ever had a manager who could hold you accountable without making you feel ashamed? Someone who could give you difficult feedback with respect? Someone who listened before reacting and who brought a kind of steadiness to the chaos? If you've experienced that kind of leadership, you remember it. It does not feel weak. It feels clear, grounded, and whole. Let's take a look at what modern psychology says about kindness in leadership. Susan David, the Harvard psychologist who pioneered the concept of emotional agility, reminds us that emotions are data, not directions. Just because we feel anger, or frustration, or hurt, doesn't mean we act from it. Instead, we acknowledge, we process, and then we choose our next step. Leaders with emotional agility can move through those steps without bypassing or suppressing what they feel. That kind of internal discipline allows kindness to emerge not as a tactic, but as a stance. And yet, kindness alone is not enough. Brené Brown, who'd researched courage and vulnerability for decades, puts it this way: clear is kind, unclear is unkind. That line has stayed with me because it reminds us that kindness without clarity can become muddled. It can lead to ambiguity, to blurred lines, to missed expectations. Leaders who are kind but unclear may find themselves carrying the burden of underperformance or managing resentment from their teams. So the work is to integrate both, to be kind and clear, compassionate and candid, firm and fair. This is not easy, especially in workplaces where the dominant tone is sharp, fast, or competitive. Adam Grant, organizational psychologist and author of Think Again, makes the case for what he calls disagreeable givers and agreeable takers. It's a matrix of interpersonal style and motivation. Some people are nice, but self-serving. Others are blunt, but generous. The ideal leader, Grant suggests, is someone who can deliver hard truths in a way that still signals care. That's what builds trust. Because trust is the real currency of leadership. And kindness, when practiced authentically, builds it. Not in one moment, but over time, through the small, consistent actions that tell people you're paying attention, that you remember their names, that you notice when they're not themselves, that you're not managing them as units of productivity, but as human beings. Of course, there are those who will take advantage of kindness. This is a reality, and it's often used as an argument against leading with warmth. But let me offer an alternative view. When kindness is paired with boundaries, it becomes a force, not a vulnerability. If you can say no clearly, if you can protect your time and energy, if you can hold people accountable while still showing them respect, then kindness becomes your edge, not your weakness. I've coached leaders who thought they had to choose between being respected and being liked. But that's a false binary. Respect does not come from harshness. It comes from integrity, from consistency, from the courage to be yourself when it would be easier to perform a version of leadership that pleases the crowd but drains the soul. One of my clients was praised recently for her empathy. She remembered birthdays. She knew people's families. She checked in regularly with a night shift, not because she had to, but because she cared. And then came a moment when she had to make a deeply unpopular decision about resources. People braced for conflict. But the decision, though painful, was delivered with clarity, fairness, and total transparency. And the trust she'd built carried her through. People disagreed with her, but they didn't distrust her. That's the difference. Kindness doesn't mean everyone agrees with you. It means they believe you mean what you say, and that they matter to you, even when they're not getting what they want. There's also a gendered element to all of this. Studies show that women in leadership are more likely to have their warmth interpreted as a weakness. Men who are kind are often called compassionate. Women who are kind are sometimes called soft. Now, that double standard adds an extra layer of pressure on female leaders to strike the perfect tone. Not too emotional, not too cold, not too nice, not too tough. I've seen this dynamic play out with leaders who try to dial down their natural warmth to meet an unspoken expectation. But the most effective leaders I know don't suppress their kindness. They sharpen their clarity. They make sure their compassion has a backbone. Let's talk about boundaries for a moment. A kind leader without boundaries becomes a sponge, absorbing the stress of others, over-accommodating, struggling to say no. Kindness without self-care leads to burnout, resentment, and depletion. So when someone tells you that kindness is your strength, remember to ask yourself, am I also protecting the source of that kindness? Because if the well runs dry, the whole system suffers. There's something else that happens when leaders lead with kindness. It creates permission. Permission for others to be human, to show emotion, to admit mistakes, to ask for help. That kind of culture is not only healthier, it's even more innovative. When people are not afraid to speak up, they collaborate more. They take smarter risks, and they work on their own. And they own their work. In a high-performing team, kindness is not a footnote. It's the environment in which performance can thrive. And now a word about the inner critic. Many kind leaders I know second-guess themselves. They worry that they'll be seen as too soft, too emotional, or too sentimental. They worry that if they show care, they'll lose authority. But that fear is often internalized from old narratives, old workplaces, outdated models of what leadership should look like. The job is not to be immune from that voice. The job is to recognize it and choose whether or not to listen. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand firm in your own values, even when they are misread. Leadership is not performance, it's presence. So if you're kind, please stay kind, but be precise. Let people know what you expect. Let them know what you value. And let them see that your compassion does not come from a need to be liked, but from a commitment to lead well. Let me end with a personal reflection. Over the years, I've worked with all kinds of leaders. Bold ones, brilliant ones, quiet ones, charismatic ones. And the ones I remember most clearly are the ones that have made people feel safe enough to be themselves. The ones who led not through fear, but through presence. The ones who knew that kindness is not weakness, it's courage. Please mind the gap.
That was Mind the Gap with Michael Comyn. If today's episode on kindness offered you a moment of pause or a spark of reflection, we'd love you to share it with someone who's shown you kindness. You'll find more episodes, show notes, and upcoming themes wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, be kind to yourself. Until next time, mind the gap.